And it's BBOR Black Box Online Radio coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. Hello and welcome to the show. My name is Ned DeHaan and I am your host. Thank you for starting your day with some true crime talk radio. My guest on the program today is B.D. Salerno, the author of the book Richard Speck and the Eight Nurses Deconstructing a Mass Murder. B.D., are you with us?
I'm with you and I'm happy to be here.
I can hear you loud and clear. Very nice. So, out of curiosity, why did you decide to write a book about Richard Speck?
Well, I'm a true crime aficionado, and I can remember the Richard Speck murder of 8 nurses because I was 15 years old that summer. And just it was an innocent day. I was planning on going to the beach, and I happened to see the headlines of the morning newspaper, 8 student nurses slain. And it really had a very negative effect on me. I had been living a fairly naive, sheltered life as a teenager in middle class New Jersey. And I had never read anything that horrible before. It was like my awakening to the big bad world. And so I never forgot the crime. As I grew up, I became interested in psychology and the paranormal, all kinds of things that explain human behavior. And I never forgot the crime. And that interest progressed to true crime, where I would often hear about Richard Speck, and I would remember how the crime had affected me when I was a young girl. So when we had the pandemic in 2020, I was kind of poking around for something to do. And I had been thinking of looking into mass murders. And the first thing that came to mind was the Richard Speck case. Now, bear in mind that when that happened, there were many questions as to how one man who was reportedly drunk and on drugs could overtake 9 women without resistance, struggling, or screaming. And a lot of people were asking the same questions. But back in the 60s, we really didn't challenge the authorities. We accepted what they had to say. So those questions were always kind of lingering in the background. And when I started to research the crime in 2020, I just started to find things that were incongruous, and they were adding up. I was beginning to see red flags waving at me from the periphery. And so I got all in on the crime. I ordered FOIA reports from the police. I got reports from the FBI. I ordered reports from the Coast Guard because Richard Speck had just signed up as a merchant marine when all this happened, and basically got my hands on everything I could read. And I began to research the crime in earnest. You just went out. Are you still there?
Oh, yes, I'm still here.
Okay,
And
good.
for the listeners, if you could provide a basic introduction as to what this crime was that Richard Speck committed, and many people are going to be familiar with the names, the South Chicago Massacre, the Townhouse Massacre,
Right,
but would you like to
right.
provide an introduction for us?
Sure. Richard Speck basically was a 24-year-old career criminal who was born and raised in Illinois but had grown up in Dallas. After his father died, his mother married a second time, and he was moved to Dallas where the family had relocated. His stepfather was very cruel and violent, and so he had a rough upbringing. He started getting into trouble at an early age, and he had racked up about 36 investigative arrests as a juvenile. Those are not real arrests. Those mean that he simply was hauled in for questioning regarding some kind of, truancy or vandalism. That's mostly what he was getting into as a teenager, getting drunk in public, stuff like that. So by the time he goes up to Chicago, where his older siblings lived, and they were trying to maintain some sort of structure in his life, he went up there at the age of 24. He signed up with the Merchant Marine because he wanted some sort of stable work, and he liked being on the lake. They were all out in the Lake Michigan. So he ends up in Chicago in March, April of 1966. At that time, South Chicago Community Hospital was a training hospital for student nurses. It was about a mile north of the murder address, which was 2319 East 100th Street on the southeast side of Chicago. There were 8 student nurses living there. Actually, there were 5. 3 of the nurses were from the Philippines. They were already practicing nurses, but they were lodging with student nurses on through the hospital. It was a rental agreement with the hospital. So there were 5 American student nurses and 3 Filipino nurses. And they lived together. They shared very cramped quarters in this townhouse. There were 3 small bedrooms on the second floor, 1 small bathroom, which for 8 young women must have been a real challenge. But anyway, they were about to graduate in about 3 weeks after the time of the crime. Now, Richard Speck was kind of an itinerant. He spent his days in and out of bars and shooting pool, playing on Bowlamatic or Stratomatic, whatever the bowling machine was in those bars at the time. And he was just kind of hanging around waiting for work, waiting for a shipping assignment to come up on a Great Lakes freighter. What happened was on the night of the crime, this is the official narrative. I call it the official narrative because I have, of course, another alternate narrative that I constructed after my research. Around 10:30 at night, he leaves a bar and he walks 1.6 miles west to the nurse's townhouse. Now, that's quite a long walk considering it was mostly vacant lots that he had to go through. He had to go across the Calumet River Bridge. So it was a substantial walk for somebody who had been drinking all day. He gets to the townhouse at 11 o'clock and he breaks in by lifting a screen off the rear kitchen window, which was adjacent to the rear door. He goes upstairs where there are 3 bedrooms, and 2 of the bedrooms were open, but 1 was closed. He goes upstairs and goes to the closed bedroom and knocks at the door. Inside are 2 Filipino nurses, Corazon Amarao and Merlita Gargulo, her roommate. He knocks on the door and brandishes a gun, and he says, "I'm here to rob you. I'm not going to hurt you. Just do what I say." So he walks them down the hall, and as he's walking them down to a larger bedroom, he rounds up the nurses in the other bedrooms, brings them into the large bedroom, which I'll call the south bedroom, and he has them sit down in a circle at his feet. I don't know how much of the narrative I want to stray off on, but I'll just give a basic blueprint of what happened. He then sets aside his gun and he takes out a knife. He removes a sheet from a bed and starts to cut the sheet into long cotton strips, which he uses to tie up each of the nurses at the ankles and with their hands behind their backs. He does this one at a time while they're all sitting on the floor in silence. At that time, 3 of the nurses were still out. There were 6 in the room and 2 were out. 3 were out, and they came in progressively while this is in progress. He ties them all up, and this is after he's taken their cash. They had some cash on them. He had them get their cash out of their purses. And for some unknown reason, he then takes the first victim, Pamela Wilkening, and since he's already tied her up, he has to untie her ankles. He unties her ankles, walks her down the hallway to another bedroom where he stabs her in the heart, and she is killed. He returns to the south bedroom. At that exact moment, 2 of the nurses who were out for the evening came back in and saw this in progress. And there are 2 stories. One is that he tied them up first. The other, which is more likely, is that he just forced them into that room. As they come up the stairs, he's just killed Pamela. He says to them, "Get over here." And he makes them go into that room where Pamela is lying deceased. And he proceeds to stab one of the girls a total of 18 times and strangle her. And then he stabs the girl next to her. I don't want to call them just the girls, Suzanne Farris and Marianne Jordan, who happen to be best friends. The tragedy of Marianne Jordan is that she did not live in that townhouse. She was spending the night with Suzanne Farris because Suzanne was getting married in the spring to her brother Philip, and they were all very close. So Mary Ann Jordan wasn't even supposed to be there. They're killed side by side. Richard Speck then returns to the bedroom where the other nurses are still tied up. By then, one of the nurses from the Philippines, Corazon Amaral, has hidden herself underneath a bunk bed. There were 3 bunk beds in the big bedroom. She shimmied underneath it and out of sight. And then progressively, the horror began. He took the next nurse out to another bedroom and strangled her. He came back in and took the next nurse out to the bedroom and slashed her throat. I'm sorry to be graphic, but this is the true crime story, and it is a horrible
Yes.
story. So this goes on, and till then, the last nurse, Gloria Davy, was left. She's the last one tied up. Corazon is underneath a bed. Richard Speck then removes all of Gloria's clothing and sexually assaults her on a bed next to the bed where Corazon was hiding. This got my curiosity because she was tied up. I don't know how he removed her clothing with her hands tied behind her back and her ankles tied together. These are part of the red flags that were popping out at me right and left. Anyway, Gloria is the only one allegedly to be sexually assaulted in this way. Corazon's still under the bed. He then picks up Gloria and carries her downstairs to the living room couch, where she is then assaulted again and strangled. And then at that point, reportedly, it was about 3:30 in the morning. So the crime took place over a span of 4.5 hours. Now, when I did the timeline, because Corazon remembered intricate details of everything that happened, considering the horrific trauma that it must have been, I did a timeline. He couldn't have left until after 4 a.m., but for other reasons, we stick with the official narrative. He leaves at 3:30, but she doesn't leave from under the bed. She stays there frozen until alarm clocks start going off for the nurses to get up and go to their morning shift at the hospital. The first alarm goes off at 5 a.m., then one goes off around 5:15 or 5:30. By then, Corazon's had enough. She's afraid that the intruder is still in the house, but she gets out from under the bed. She shakes off her ligatures that had kept her pinned under the bed most of the night, and she's afraid that he's downstairs, so she doesn't go downstairs to use the kitchen telephone to call for help. She shouts out the second floor window onto the street below. No one hears her. So she pops the screen off that window. There's a small window ledge, like a little balcony underneath that window. So she goes out onto the ledge and screams until people on the street can hear her and see her. By then, police show up. The report says that they showed up at 6 a.m. and they were officially assigned the case at 6:10 a.m. So from 11 to 6 a.m., Corazon's, bound and pretty much victim of the crime that occurred over a span of all these hours. So the police, of course, then they enter and start taking stock of the horrific crime scene. When the coroner got there, he came out and said to the reporters, "This is the crime of the century," because it was so horrible. Unfortunately, they did not have crime scene protocols. They didn't have forensics the way we know them now. It was pretty much the Stone Age of forensics, if I may say so. There were reporters tramping through the house while all this was being taken account of. They were taking photographs. They were talking. They were all over the place. There was absolutely no crime scene integrity. And that continued for the next couple of days. So that's pretty much the synopsis. Richard Speck went back to his hotel, where he slept until 11 o'clock that morning. And when he woke up, he had no memory of the night. He was wearing the same clothing that he had on the night before. There was no blood on his clothing or his body. There were no injuries on his hands. The only thing he was upset about, there was a gun in his hand. and he didn't know how he got the gun. He had blood on one hand, but when he went to the sink and washed it off, there was no injury. It was just like a smudge of blood. He has no memory or concept of what had happened the night before until the middle of the next day. He's in a bar, which is his home pretty much, and he hears on the radio of the slaughter of 8 student nurses. And he says to the bartender, "I hope they catch the son of a bitch." He was horrified to hear about the murders. They had not yet linked him up, so they didn't bring him in for 2 more days. But he spent the next couple of days doing what he always did, wandering from bar to bar. He had different flop houses that he stayed at. And finally, they picked him up around midnight of the 17th at this really seedy flop house in Skid Row, Chicago Skid Row, one of the worst places you could be found. Anyway, that's my synopsis. I don't want to get too much more bogged down if you want to, pursue any more questions.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I would like to remind the audience that I am talking to B.D. Salerno, author of Richard Speck and the 8 Nurses. And I would also like to remind you guys that if there are any other guests or topics that you would like to hear about on this channel, you can put your ideas in the comments section down below. You can also hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out Black Box Online Radio. And feel free to go through some of the links in the description box. One of them is for BuyMeACoffee.com. But there's also a sponsor for today's episode, and that is Capital One. Capital One has the Quicksilver card, which allows you to get $200 back on your first $500 that you spend in 3 months. It's a sign-on bonus. I've done this myself. It is real free money, and there's a link for that in the description box, as well as one down below there. If you are curious at all, please feel free to click the link. I kid thee not. As I said, I've done this for real. It's really just like getting money handed to you. But back to today's episode. I guess my first question, and I didn't think this was going to be my first question, is B.D. Salerno, are you saying that Richard Speck was innocent?
It is my belief that he did not commit this crime based on extensive study of all of the reports and documentation that I previously named, and reviewing the lists of evidence, trial transcripts. It is my belief that he did not commit this crime.
Okay, so as you know from Black Box Online Radio, I've done 2 full episodes on Richard Speck, as well as a short episode, and my original responses to the story, and I'm not talking about when I would watch documentaries about him on the TV as a kid, but like, this year for Black Box Online Radio, my original responses were that, kind of like what you said, how did he get 8 or 9 women to comply with these types of orders? And they did a reenactment of this in the movie Richard Speck Chicago Massacre. And then you see the women just like, just do what he says. Let's just go along with this. But once they realized that he was, murdering them, why did they choose to continue to go along with that? Like, not an ounce of pushback or fighting back. And as you also said, I mean, walking, was it 1.6 miles while intoxicated? That depends on the person, I suppose, but not everyone is up to that. And so those are my genuine things that I thought were rather bizarre. The only thing that stood out to me that made any type of sense about how he could control 8 or 9 women would be he cut the pieces of bedsheet right, but then he instructed the nurses to tie up their feet first, right?
No, I have not seen any account where he instructed them. My accounts were all that he knelt down one by one and did it himself, which also raised the question that, and it's actually in a couple of books I read, he put the gun down. He put the gun aside. And you're tying up there's 6 women initially in that room. You're tying one up, that's labor intensive. There's a gun aside him. There's 5 women free and sitting right next to it. Somebody could have grabbed it. Another thing, the door to that bedroom was right opposite the stairway that went downstairs. If you went down that stairway, you would come right to the front door. It would have been maybe 4 or 5 seconds dashing from the bedroom to the front door and get out and call for help. Nobody did that. It especially came to my mind when I read up on the nurses. I did an intensive search to learn more about their lives. And The nurses were no shrinking violets. Gloria Jean Davy was a very outspoken, strong person. She was leader in, I think, Future Nurses of America. They had clubs like that back then in Illinois. And she wasn't the type of person to take crap from people, excuse my expression, but that's just the image I got of her. She would not be somebody you would want to cross in an argument. She spoke her mind. She had a sharp tongue. And to think that she was sexually assaulted for a period of what Corazon said was 25 minutes, making absolutely no noise. Her mouth is not gagged. I mean, there's just such a thing as submitting to passivity to deflate a situation. But when somebody's beginning to attack you, I don't think you remember that you were trained to be passive. I think you respond. It's a gut level response. So that kept coming up, and the official narrative kept emphasizing these were good girls. They were kind girls. They were passive. They had been trained to be passive in the face of difficulty. And I was like, this is not somebody out of control in an emergency room. This is somebody who's pointed a gun at you, is now pointing a knife at you. And how on earth do you not at least scream it's involuntary? You're not going to think of your training in that type of situation when it escalates to that level. So people were right to question that back then. People are right to question that now. It's only that now are we open-minded enough to look at this old narrative that has been so successful over the years and think something is really wrong with this. And the same applied to other nurses. Suzanne Farris was a jokester. She was very perky. She had a good sense of humor. She played volleyball. The girls were all in very good shape physically. They were athletic. Patricia Matusik was a champion swimmer. She did water ballet. Water ballet is extremely physically demanding. I can't believe she wasn't strong enough to at least put up a resistance. So your question, Ned, is right on point. And that's where I got my impetus to delve more deeply into the crime, because I thought if these weird things are floating on the surface and nobody ever really looked at them, I want to take a look. I want to take the next step. And that's what I did for a period of 3 years while I was researching. And I didn't start writing the book right away, but it was a solid 3-year effort to decipher what really happened. And honestly, I have to tell you, we were sold a bill of goods. I don't think the crime happened the way it did at all.
But then that's going to lead to my next question, because there is a survivor to the South Chicago massacre. You've said her name many times, Corazon Amaral.
Mm-hmm.
Is this true or false? This is a popular conception about Richard Speck. Did she identify him at the trial, saying that that's the man who killed my friends? Did she say that Richard Speck was the sole perpetrator?
She did identify him at the trial, and the prosecutor told her beforehand, make a flourish, be dramatic, and she did not disappoint. She descended from the witness stand, strode across the courtroom, and pointed her finger right at his face and said, this is the man. She followed instructions to the T. The problem was, Ned, she didn't identify him right away. She did not give a concrete physical description of his face for 2 days. So here's the thing. I have to go forward into the evidence a little bit. When they came out of the crime scene and they were trying desperately to get a profile, this is what happened. And it goes against the narrative, but I'm going to tell you what it was. Everyone said she had a breakdown, that she was too upset to talk about the crime. She had to be sedated. She had to go to the hospital. She did eventually go to the hospital, but not right away. By 6:30 in the morning, she sat down with police in one of the other townhouses where the other nurses resided. And she spoke for 2 hours describing the crime in detail. She had, at that time, a Tagalog interpreter because her English wasn't really reliable. So there was no chance of error because there was an interpreter who was fluent in English. They wanted to cross their T's and dot their I's. She spoke for 2 hours. She did not have a breakdown. She calmly spoke for 2 hours describing what happened. All she said was that it was a tall man, about 6 feet, and Richard Speck was 6'1", and he was lanky. She said he was about 170. Well, he weighed 160. He was quite thin, and he was dressed in all black from the shoes to the top. He had black shoes, black pants, a black jacket. Now, this jacket that was described was a corduroy jacket. It was 74 degrees that night. Chicago had had a heat wave that week. I don't know why a person would be wearing a lined corduroy jacket at night, much less wearing it during the commission of a crime where you're engaged, you're swinging your arms, you're tying people up, and so forth. By the way, the jacket had no blood on it at the end of the day. But anyway, she just described a person, his height and his size, and nothing about, he had bright blue eyes, he had dirty blonde hair, he wore it combed back like the people, the men of the day. It had like a pompadour style hairstyle, and longish, not a short haircut. He did not like to wear short hair. So there was no facial description, although she mentioned that she had looked him in the eye and she had sat in the room with him and he did all these things. He handled this and then he picked up the knife and then he touched Pamela and then he did, but she did not describe his facial features. Here's the rub. When police found the body of Valentina Passion, one of her housemates, Valentina had scratched the attacker because she had flesh under her fingernails. She also clutched a short black hair between the thumb and forefinger of her right hand. That is not the hairstyle of Richard Speck. So the police put out a bolo for a man 6 feet tall, about 160, 170 pounds, short black hair. That was the first description that went out on the morning of July 14th. That did not describe Richard Speck. The other troubling thing about Corazon's account of Valentina's last hours was that Corazon testified at trial. Valentina was tied up. Her hands were tightly tied behind her back. Prosecutor asks, was she tied up when he took her out of the room? Yes, her hands were tied. I don't know how she scratched the attacker and pulled his hair out if her hands were tied behind her back. So there's a couple of more red flags for you. But anyway, Corazon did not identify him until she saw a photograph of him, which was his Coast Guard membership card. There's a little wallet-sized photo of him on that. And I believe she was led to that conclusion because a couple of days later, Speck ended up in the hospital. I don't want to get into that just yet, but he ended up in the hospital. And they brought her in as a nurse to identify him, to lock down 100% identification of Richard Speck. Here he is lying in a bed, and she comes into the room, and he thinks she's just a nurse because it was a different hospital where they were. It was Cook County Hospital. And she sees him. The police escort her back out of the room. Now, if he was there, do you not think he would have recognized her? He would have remembered seeing her. He registered absolutely nothing when she was brought in the room. And she was a little bit nervous to do that. I believe it wasn't just so that she could identify him. I believe they were showing her who she was supposed to identify.
Okay, though, but again, you have to provide another challenge question. Another commonly held belief about Richard Speck and Corazon Amaral is that Richard Speck had 9 women. I mean, let's just say the killer, because you're disputing the theory. The killer had 9 women at one point, and 8 of them were murdered. Corazon Amaral survived by crawling under the bed and hiding. And this is, again, just the basic info that you'll find online, and that is that the way that she was able to hide under the bed and not get attacked by the killer is because he simply lost count, lost track, forgot about her, wasn't paying close attention, and is there any possibility that Richard Speck committed the murders and he didn't remember Corazon Amaral simply because he wasn't paying that close attention to any of the victims in terms of their facial similarities and or their facial features, I mean, and anything about their physical appearance, that he was more just focused on his own agenda? Is there any possibility?
I would say there is a remote possibility, but when I went over it with what the information I had, the whole story had to be cohesive, and this puts a hole in that. In other words, it was widely reported how extremely meticulous he was. He cut the bed strips a certain way. He was very methodical. He's very organized, despite having ingested about, I don't know how many, he took about 6 pills that day, and he had about 18 drinks from what I could count, which is a typical day for him. But here he is methodically doing all these step by step, almost in a ritualistic fashion. And Corazon was his first point of contact. He spoke to her. When he knocked on the door, well, there's another thing. Does a burglar knock on a door after he's already broken in? We'll just set that one aside for the moment. He spoke to her. He looked at her. She was the one. There was a point at which someone knocked on the back door during all this rounding up of the nurses. And he took Corazon and Merlita at gunpoint, said, "You were going to go downstairs." I don't know why he thought he was going to open the door to a witness, but Corazon led him to a different door. You see, the doorbells had a different sound so that they could discern which door somebody was ringing the bell at. She took him to the wrong door. The witness walked away thinking, oh, they must have gone to bed. Then she brings him back upstairs. He had plenty of time to take note of her because the narrative was that he had been stalking the women. He had been spying on them. He would have known what they looked like. And he was so methodical as to kill someone and then go to the bathroom and rinse the blood off his hands and knife, and then go back and do the whole thing all over again. If you are that meticulous, how do you then lose track of the very first person that you confronted, who let you in, who walked you through the house to where the doorbell was not rung, and then you lose track of them? It really doesn't jive in terms of promoting that he was a meticulous, organized type of killer. Plus the beds, here's another thing. I don't know if you remember bunk beds. They're not the same as a box spring and a mattress. There's more space under them. And I looked at photographs of the bunk beds in the townhouse, all of them, and they appeared to be a good foot to 14, 15 inches off the floor. They are not low to the floor like a bed where you could just barely shove a shoebox. They were a substantial distance from the floor. As petite as she was, these were narrow bunk beds. I don't see how he could have surveyed the room, which she said he did, and not seen her. That to me, that eluded me. So I just did not, and considering all the other inconsistencies that I haven't even gotten around to, I just don't see how that happened. It is possible to answer your question, yes. But in my view, it's unlikely.
But though, we have to have a follow-up because you don't have to give away all the secrets of your book. But do you believe that Corazon Amaral had any mischievous role in the South Chicago massacre?
Ned, I really don't know. I have thought about this time and again. I don't know. I will commit myself to say that she knows a lot more than what we ever got from the story.
Okay, because it sounds like everything you've said to this point is that Corazon Amaral is deceptive to a certain point, and I was like, well, what do we make of that? I mean, I know you just said I don't know.
Well, here's what I think. Here's a
Yes.
young girl from a poor family in the Philippines, a family of 8 children, very poor. The Philippines has a tradition of nursing and medicine, and they're very well known throughout the world. Their nurses are top notch. Back in the 60s, we had a huge shortage of nursing. That brought Filipino nurses to our shores in the thousands, and many of them stayed on, as Corazon did. She comes from a poor family. She is educated at Far East University in Manila. She gets her nursing degree. She does some very good work there. And then she is selected into this exchange program in Chicago. She had a lot at stake. Here she is trying to make her way. She's in a new country where she wanted to stay. She does live here now. She's been here for 50 some odd years. How hard would it be to coerce somebody like that? To listen, don't you talk, we will hit your family. You'll never practice nursing again. We'll send you home. You'll never come to this country again. There was a lot of leverage against her. So I thought maybe, I don't know that she was directly involved, but I thought, well, here's somebody who could be pretty easy to threaten to go along with a certain narrative. On the other hand, I have other ideas based on some of the information I got. And I have to say, I am still waiting on 300 pages of reports from the FBI. They will not be available for another 2 years. So I decided I was just going to go ahead with the book. I felt like I had plenty to support my own personal theories on the case, but there's more to come. I have to unfortunately wait 2 more years to find out what it is.
But wait a second, I do have to take a certain exception to the scenario that you just laid out, that somebody intimidated Corazon Amaral into silence. They've just killed 8 student nurses. Why let Corazon Amaral survive at all? I mean, why scare her into silence?
Because I think they needed that witness to nail down Richard Speck, who was, in my view, a patsy. They needed somebody to drive home that it was him, because all they had direct evidence, which on paper, direct evidence is great. But the direct evidence they had was a very shaky description. If you look at the police sketch that went out, it doesn't look anything like him. It's a man with short black hair. And the second thing they had was fingerprints. And I have devoted a whole section of my book to how I believe the fingerprints ended up on the south bedroom door. And they were, I'm telling you, they looked like something from a kindergarten art project. They did not look like fingerprints. They were, I would call them blobs or smudges. They had 3 partial fingerprints on the south bedroom door in a peculiar position. One was 16 inches off the floor. Richard Speck at 6'1" would have to be kneeling on the floor in order to leave that fingerprint mark there. And there's a whole story to the fingerprints. But anyway, the 2 things, the direct evidence, well, they had to have Corazon. Some of the other evidence was very flimsy, as I go into the fingerprint evidence, which I consider part of that group. They never got a confession. They wanted one very badly, to the extent that I believe that they subjected Richard Speck to truth serum, sodium pentothal, and they got nothing out of it. All he ever said was, I don't remember. I have no memory of that night. I don't know why I woke up in bed with a gun. And he never said I didn't do it. He never denied it. In fact, he was a pretty pathetic person at the end, because he allowed himself to be convinced that he was guilty. He was a very weak man. I believe he suffered from some traumatic brain injury, from several injuries as a child, but he was seen by boards of psychiatrists. He spent a lot of time, and he spent several months. He had his own personal psychiatrist that wrote about him in the bestseller Born to Raise Hell, which was the tattoo on his arm. And that made him famous. He was made famous by that. His psychiatrist wrote a book that showed a side of Richard Speck that nobody's really seen, that I felt very moved by, because it just didn't sound like the same person. But anyway, he did not deny doing the crime. He ended up saying to his psychiatrist after about a month or 2 of incarceration, and I quoted it in my book. He says, well, she said I did it. The police say I did it. The psychiatrists say I did it. I must have done it. He caved. He did not have the mental resolve to resist all the pressure that he felt from all these authorities. And so he believed that he did it. He went on for the rest of his life believing that he did it. And when he was sentenced to death, he said, I deserve this. I deserve to burn. If I really did this, I should die. And he never got upset over being sentenced to death, because he felt he did it. It was unanimous. Everybody felt he did it. And so what do you say to somebody like that when he finally started talking about the crime in jail, which was a whole another section of my book? He said, "Oh yeah, I did it. I did it. It wasn't their night. It's just those 8 nurses. It just wasn't their night." Well, of course he said that because the video he made was supposed to be a mockery of the whole system. There they are in a video made in 1988. He's already in jail for 20 some odd years. And it was a mock interview about the nurses. It was in very poor taste. I think by then he was out of his gourd on drugs and alcohol, which he continued to do drugs the whole time he was in jail. He had a ball in jail. He had the best time of his life. He had all the drugs he wanted. And so he said, "Yeah, I did it. It wasn't their night." But once you're in prison and you're a hardened criminal in prison and you have this cred from being this guy that killed all these nurses, are you going to start turning around saying you didn't do it? He wanted to look tough to his peers. He had always been that way. He used to go into bars and tell crazy stories about having killed a lot of people in Vietnam. And he told people he was a drug runner for a Mexican cartel, which was all made up tales to make himself look tough to other people. It actually made him look like a real fool. But that by the end of his life, I don't think he had any reason to start denying that he did it because he believed that he did it. And so anyway, getting back to Corazon, I believe there was enough to coerce her into silence. And she also benefited tremendously after the crime. She didn't sell her story. She did have a resistance to selling her story, but she joined in several lawsuits that were settled out of court with quite high, I will say, premiums. And so she also received $5,000 for turning Richard Speck in. And back then that was like $50,000 now. So she had her perks. She had said, I want to live in the States. She was given a job in the States. And so I think that it was a question of survival. She was a survivor. We just don't know to what extent she was a survivor.
And are you referencing the thing that it's not exactly a documentary, but it's called Richard Speck, The Lost Tapes, sometimes it's called The
Yes.
Lost Tapes of Richard Speck?
Yes. Yes. Those are
I
the
was about
ones
to bring that up
yeah.
because on that one, I mean, he's asked not only about whether or not, he's committed the crime. The exact question that I was remembering was, what did you feel when you were doing it? And then he says the same thing I always felt. Nothing. You must remember that one, right?
Right. Yeah.
But
Right.
you're saying that he's been locked into the story and he's just gone with this narrative for so long and he's accepted in his mind that he has done it?
I think that was the case. And I think, like I said, once you're in jail with a bunch of hardened criminals, you want to maintain any, veneer of toughness that you have. It was a toughness that he never had in the outside world. People thought he was a fool. He was a jerk. He went into bars and drank and ran his mouth. So in jail, he has this persona of mass murderer. And I think he got so little out of life after that he hung his hat on that one title, unfortunately.
I mean, that just is bringing up so many other questions, and we can take the conversation in several different directions. But you brought up about how a lot of people thought Richard Speck was like a lowlife or a jerk, or they weren't impressed by him. When I did my first episode about him for Black Box Online Radio, it was called Richard Speck, the World's Most Annoying Murderer. Now, you don't accuse him of the South Chicago massacre, but my assessment of him was he didn't seem like a typical mass murderer or serial killer. I refer to him as a jerk who got out of control, where he's getting like passes. And as you said, he was brought in to the police station 36 times as a juvenile. I hope I didn't misquote that. And he just seemed like someone who was an unsavory person who broke the rules frequently, a troublemaker, a nuisance, menace to society, all of that. And his crimes escalated. And
Right.
of course, you have proposed a theory that they didn't escalate all the way to the South Chicago massacre. But do you agree or disagree with my assessment of him?
That he was an annoying type of person.
Well, not only that, but
Or
like
the
he was an annoying person who got out of control and his deviant behavior led
yeah,
his
he
deviant
did get
behavior
a
escalated and exploded.
yes, he was starting to show an escalation, I think. Most of his crimes as a teenager were, like I said, vandalism, public drinking, breaking somebody's window, and stuff like that. The moment he turned 18, he committed a burglary, and then there were, after that, he had 5 arrests as an adult. One was practically the day after he turned 18. The last two involved a knife pulled on a woman in a robbery of her purse. And I believe he also got angry at a patron in a bar and he stabbed the man. He didn't kill him. He stuck the knife into, just stuck him with the knife. And so he was escalating. The thing about this crime, though, was that his crimes were impulse crimes. He would smash and grab. He would break into somebody's house. He wasn't even very good at it. He got caught every time he did something. He all the worst crime in terms of which is interesting. It's not the worst from what we can see it from a point of view of violence, but the crime that put him away for 3 years was forgery. He forged a check. He stole an employee's check and forged it, a $44 paycheck. And for that, he was sent to Huntsville in Texas for 3 years. However, he got out after just a little over a year, violated parole, got picked up, violated parole again. Then, before he's even done 3 years' time, he is discharged from Huntsville, let go. He's not paroled, he's discharged, which meant at the time no supervision. So something funny. The guy was either incredibly lucky or they were incredibly bad at record keeping in Huntsville. He was out on this. Then he committed another crime, and that's what drove him up to Chicago in March of 1966. He hopped on a bus for Chicago because he at once again had eluded the law. So yeah, he was a no good. He was a disturbed individual, but his crimes were kind of stupid and thoughtless, and that's why he kept getting caught. I don't see him carrying something out that is this devious. And with, as I said, the extent of which I think things were manipulated in the aftermath of the crime, it seemed to me that it was being pointed in his direction because he had so many arrests and because he had been known to carry a knife. And he was a perfect fall guy for this.
Now, another question would be, do you believe that Richard Speck was responsible for the murder of Mary Catherine Pierce? And it's been a while since I've done the episode. I believe that crime took place before the South Chicago massacre.
Yes, that crime took place in Monmouth in early April of 66, where he happened to be staying in Monmouth because his brother, like I said, his family kept trying to reform him. His brother got him a job apprenticing as a carpenter, and the family originally was from Monmouth, and many of them were still there. So he was in Monmouth and he was learning carpentry. He used to hang out at this bar, Frank's Place, and that was near where the body of Mary Kay Pierce was found when Speck was in Monmouth. The body was reportedly found by her sister, and it was found in a hog shed. And Richard Speck had been building hog sheds for this apprenticeship program. Um, I'm not sure on that. I had thought, when I finished the book, which I did just a couple of months ago, I thought maybe I will requisition the files for that murder and see what happened. The thing about that murder, Mary Kay was beaten to death. She wasn't stabbed, she was beaten to death. She was found naked in the shed. I don't know that he would have done that. I can't say, but I did mention that in my book because people were starting to pin that on him. Now, here's the troubling part of that scenario. The chief of police of Monmouth was a man named Harold Tinder. Harold Tinder was best friends with Eugene Thornton, who was Richard Speck's brother-in-law, who he stayed with when he was in Chicago. He stayed with them on and off because they kept kicking him out of the house because he was a pain in the neck. And that's when he would go and stay at all the different flop houses and flea bags that he stayed at. Well, they suspected him. So why didn't the chief of police contact Gene Thornton and say, we want to pick up your brother for questioning in this murder? They never did. They knew each other. His brother-in-law knew the chief of police. The chief of police knew where Richard Speck was. They could have picked him up at any time. That just went by the boards. I don't know that that crime was ever solved either. Mary Kay
Right.
Pierce.
I believe that that's a cold case as of now,
Yes.
and Richard Speck is regarded as the prime suspect, most likely because of his fame. And I mean, he's the only suspect that I can tell you in the murder of Mary Catherine Pierce. But it sounds like you're disputing a lot of the narrative around Richard Speck, that you're referring to him more as a petty criminal. I mean, definitely someone who broke the law regularly. But if I understand your assessment of the situation, you don't believe that his crimes escalated to murder.
That's my personal opinion. I don't really know who killed Mary Kay Pierce. I would like to look further into that, but
Yeah.
there could have been other people. I know she had an ex-husband, and I know there was somebody at the bar she worked with that I don't know if they were questioned. There were other individuals on the periphery of that crime. That's why I wanted to maybe someday look further into that. But I don't know that he did that. I'm not saying he didn't do it. I'm just saying I really don't know. He was a person who, with a knife, she was beaten up and she was naked. I don't know. You know, I don't want to look like I'm covering for him, but at the same time, from my knowledge of the case, it just seemed too convenient that he was not picked up as the main suspect when they had every way of knowing where he was.
Okay, though, I would like to go back to Richard Speck in the hospital after the South Chicago massacre. Again, this is another pop culture understanding of Richard Speck. Did Corazon Amaral previously say that he has a tattoo that says "Born to Raise Hell" on his arm, and that's how he was identified?
No, that is one of the myths that is commonly repeated out there. At trial, she testified. I have it. I actually put her trial transcript in the appendix to my book. That's why the book is so long, because I went through everything and took it apart, as I said, deconstructing. She testified at trial. I did not notice any tattoo. She never saw tattoos on him. The person who saw the tattoo was Dr. Leroy Smith, who was attending him at the hospital and had seen a photograph of the tattoo in the morning paper and saw it on Speck's arm, saw it in the paper, because by then they had his name out there. The chief of police had already announced his guilt in the matter when he was arrested. He went on TV and said, he's the one who did it, he's guilty. And so the doctor saw the tattoo on his arm, and the doctor was the one who called the police, who subsequently showed up and arrested him in the hospital.
Okay, though, again, you don't have to reveal everything in your book, but I'm sure all of the listeners of Black Box Online Radio are going to be wondering, in your theory, if Richard Speck didn't commit the South Chicago massacre, who did?
That's the money question. I started, once I had mapped out comparisons of all the physical documents that I could, I devoted a portion of the book to what could have happened. Now, in my view, the common denominator with all these women was the hospital. So I couldn't get any records from the hospital. The hospital has been sold and merged several times, and this was 1966. I just didn't have much luck at that. So I did go into legal databases to search for cases involving the hospital. And I was really alarmed to see how many malpractice cases have been filed against that hospital over the years. Now, I couldn't get back to the 60s, but a funny thing happened, and it was a stroke of, I would say, serendipity. A lawsuit was filed in 1980 by an African American woman who claimed that in 1967, when she went to have a medical abortion at South Chicago Community Hospital, her tubes were tied without her knowledge. And yes, so she didn't know that that was in 67. Now the attending physician was the attending physician, head of OBGYN at that hospital throughout the 60s. He was an eminent doctor in Chicago. He was hailed as at one point Doctor of the Month or Doctor of the Week in one of the publications. He was the head of Planned Parenthood's medical board in Chicago and a very influential character. He was the one who performed the tubal ligation and then told the worried patient, you'll still be able to have children. You'll be able to plan it better. We'll give you some birth control devices and you'll be able to plan having a child when you're ready. He had tied her tubes. He knew that she wasn't going to be able to have any more children. This happened again shortly later with another African-American young woman who went for a routine procedure. Years later, finds out she can't bear children because her tubes had been tied. She also sued the hospital. Now, because of a lot of legal wrangling and statute of limitations, the cases really didn't get anywhere. They were appealed, but I'm not aware of them being successfully brought on plaintiff's behalf. I think they were just tossed aside because of statute of limitations. Unfortunately, the first woman, it took her 13 years to find out what had been done to her. Now, sterilization was legal in many southern states throughout the U.S. That's a big part of my research that I had to go into. But it was not legal in Chicago. I mean, it was not legal in Illinois in the 1960s. So these were illegal practices. They were done without the knowledge of the patients. And so because the nurses had to have training in the, obviously had to have training in OBGYN, and half of them wanted to become pediatric nurses, I imagine they spent a fair amount of time in this very operating room. Now, this is where I go into theory, and I want to emphasize to your viewers, this is my theory. Say what you will, conspiracy. However, there was a conspiracy, I believe, but this is my theory. These were very spirited young nurses. Gloria Davy had wanted to join the Peace Corps. Now, at that time, the Peace Corps was a program set up by President John F. Kennedy, where young, aspiring, idealistic students would go to third world nations and help the poor people of those nations. It was a very popular program in the 60s. Most of the time, they ended up going to Africa, somewhere in Africa. Gloria Davy had wanted to join that. I don't know that someone who wants to go and feed and care for the starving Africans in Africa would want to have anything to do with sterilizing African American women in the hospital. She didn't have that kind of a temperament. Do you know what I'm saying? I don't think she would have put up with that if she knew that that was going on. So my feeling was maybe somebody was going to blow the whistle. Maybe somebody was going to, you shouldn't be doing this. This is wrong. I'm going to tell the authorities. I really don't know. But my feeling was that it might have had something to do with illegal practices at the hospital that may also extend to possibly trafficking of drugs. I don't know. They saw something at the hospital, and I think somebody was going to speak up. That's just my theory, and I made that very clear in the book because it is a departure from the deconstructing that I did before.
Another big question would be, if this is the case, do you believe that there were multiple attackers or a single attacker?
I think there were at least two. The reason being, I also reviewed the autopsy reports. Now, I am not a pathologist. I am not qualified to review an autopsy report. I did have some medical training. I can read medical vocabulary. So I studied anatomy and physiology. I was pretty conversant with the terms. That doesn't mean I can interpret it. But as I was reading them, I'm noticing that some of the nurses who were not strangled had deep bruises around what would be the carotid artery portion of the neck. And I believe somebody squeezed them, did a chokehold, and subdued them before they were stabbed. That would explain the lack of screaming. If someone comes behind you and puts a neck compression and you pass out quickly, you don't have time to scream. And then someone from the front wields the knife. I don't see how Richard Speck could have done a neck compression on one nurse and then whirled around and stabbed her in the heart, which was the case with Pamela Wilkening. And this held true to some of the other nurses as well. They had marks on their necks when they had not been strangled. The ones strangled, you can, of course, understand bruising on the neck. But the ones that were stabbed had marks on their necks that were unexplained. So I felt there had to be two people, one to grab the person, the other to, inflict the harm. And that would go a long way toward explaining the lack of struggling, the lack of resistance, and the lack of screaming. I believe they were just set upon. I also think maybe they were drugged at some point. I don't know. I did look at the tox screens, which were negative for alcohol, except in one case, but it was a very small amount, and negative for barbiturates. But you can get other types of drugs from a hospital. So that left open the possibility that they were subdued. I also felt that because of the lack of blood spatter around the rooms, possibly they were already down when they were killed. So that if they're down on the floor, you're not going to have so much cast off as if they were struggling and, standing up straight and resisting. So all that played into my assessment that there was more than one person. I believe the persons probably were from the hospital. Maybe they were known to the nurses that they could have come in at night and nobody got alarmed because they knew who they were. And there were other things in the autopsy reports that were very revealing. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but don't worry, Ned. I am not going to reveal everything in my book because there's 400 pages of information. I'm definitely not going to give it all away here. I will run out of time well before that.
Okay, though, but how would you go about proving your theory and more or less establishing the claim? Because one thing that I think comes to mind for everyone would be, if you believe that Corazon Amaral was in on this, then if she were to make some type of deathbed confession or leave some type of confession in an envelope that's in a safety deposit box, something like that. But how would you go about certifying this claim?
Oh, I don't know that I can prove my theory. I just believe that based on all the evidence and documentation that I reviewed, it holds more water than the narrative that has been passed down to us since 1966. I don't think I can prove who did it without further investigation. As I said, it's a theory, but I think in terms of the questions that this case has raised for 55 some odd years, going in my direction makes a whole lot more sense than accepting the official narrative at face value. There's just too many holes in that story to plug up with. There's nothing to plug them up with, actually.
So let's do a bit of recapping. Firstly, Richard Speck is a drunk and a low-life criminal, and you believe that somebody, in perhaps the hospital, concocted this plan to silence people who had some type of knowledge that was very detrimental to the hospital, that would have destroyed not only their careers, but an entire operation. So they hatched a plan. We're going to get rid of 8 of these people, and the 9th one we're going to keep around to corroborate our story. That was all calculated. Corazon didn't hide under the bed like she said. If she did hide under the bed, then they found her, and then they used her to their advantage. Richard Speck didn't do this. You think that he was a real criminal, but you're not certain if he was a murderer or not. And is that a fair assessment so far?
No, that's great. Yes, that's exactly where I've been heading. I just want to say one thing that, as you just touched upon, Corazon hiding under the bed, here is another important piece that, of course, I'm trying to keep everything general for this, just for the sake of getting through this. She supposedly hid under the bed while her hands were tied behind her, which is very painful to have for several hours, and her ankles tied together. And she said, "He tied me up very, very tight." Okay. So she's tied up around 12:30 at night. She doesn't come loose until 5:30 in the morning, say that's 5 hours. And during which time she shimmied under a bed, she squeezed herself against the wall, she pressed her head to the floor. She was in a very uncomfortable position. Yet when she got free of her ligatures and the doctors examined her, they found absolutely no trace of injury. No abrasions, no scrapes, no black and blues, nothing. Now, I don't know how you can be hogtied like that and struggle under a bed for hours and not have some kind of a bruise. She was free of injury, much the same as Richard Speck's hands were free of injury when he supposedly used a folding knife that was about 2 3/4 inches long, which didn't match some of the wounds that were 4 inches long. I mean, there's a lot, there's so much to it, and I don't want to, put it all into this one piece here because it's complicated. But Corazon, I don't think she hid under the bed. She would have had some injury to her. She would have had some abrasions on her wrists because that's a very uncomfortable position to stay in for 5 hours.
So she's really becoming the focus of our discussion. And then I have to ask, what is Corazon doing during this event that's taking place? Is she just kind of sitting by patiently? Is she tied up like some of the other victims and they just decide to spare her life with the blackmail thing? Or what do you think she was experiencing during the South Chicago massacre?
I wish I knew. I have spent a great deal of 3 years thinking that one over.
Feel free to speculate.
Yeah, no, here's what I think happened. Well, we're going back into other evidence that I'm going to be sidetracking too much for. I think she had some idea through a doctor that something was going down. And I think that these murders took place like a blitz. I think that they took place maybe all within 20, 30 minutes. They may have even taken place in stages. If only 2 nurses were home and the rest were still out, they were dispatched and put aside. There was plenty of the way the rooms were laid out. You could easily close a door and never see 2 bodies on the floor inside the room. I think that they maybe took place over a period of hours where a nurse would come into the house and never know what happened, and then she would be set upon. The reason I can say that with a fair amount of certainty, it was that going back to the autopsy reports, 2 of the nurses had undigested food in their digestive tracts, and yet they were not reportedly killed until 2 or 3 in the morning, 7 or 8 hours after they ate. So I go into that a little bit. I had to do a lot of research into digestive processes for that. But then there was a question of Gloria Davies' body. She's the only one found naked, the only one found on the first floor on the couch, face down. But she has marked dependent lividity in her back, which takes several hours to set. So she was moved. These bodies were moved. I believe they were positioned because they were found very neatly laying side by side. The 2 Filipino women were lying across each other in like a weird X pattern, which was bizarre. But the rest of them were neatly laid out and covered with blankets. So, I don't know what Corazon was doing. I wonder if she was doing some cleanup. I don't know if she covered them with the blankets. Nobody knew who did that. She never talked about that. She never mentioned that. I don't know what she was doing. I hate to put the finger on her because I just don't know, and it's not fair. But I can say she knows a lot more. She knows what happened. I think she was probably threatened and taken aside. And I mean, you come from a poor country where your only real opportunity is where you are and to stay in this country. And she did very well for herself. I think that that's enough of a motivation, but I think also, I suspect she may not have liked some of these women and not been unduly affected by their death. There were undercurrents in the house about somebody dating somebody, and I don't have a lot of information on that. I have scraps of information on that, but that's enough to suggest, can you really have 8 20-somethings who are students living together where there's not some sort of maybe gossip or, jealousy going on? It's 8 young women. 3 of them are culturally in shock for coming to this country, and they really did not mesh that well with the American girls. And the American girls were kind of boisterous and loud and cliquey, and they had their own little club going on. So there could have well been some distaste to where, it's a horrible thing that happened, but I never got the sense from her interviews subsequent to the crime that Corazon was all that completely distraught over it. She actually said to a reporter 3 years, 1969, she said, "Oh, I've pretty much forgotten about it." I don't know how you forget something like that. It's in the news. I've got it in the Chicago Tribune if anybody wants to see it. She said, "I've pretty much forgotten it." And in the years to come, when she did give interviews, she contradicted things that she had said to the police in the beginning. So I just started to think, here's somebody that was not really emotionally involved and was taken aside, and maybe she helped do some cleanup. I really don't know. But I have, believe me, given a lot of thought to that, and I can't really put my finger on it without knowing more about what really happened. And as we know, I can't figure that out to certainty either at this point.
But in defense of Corazon Amaral, I did also hear an interview clip that I think is somewhat famous when you look into the Richard Speck case. And she might have been talking to Oprah, actually. And this is after the passing of Richard Speck. And she
Mhm.
says that she lived in fear all the way up until his death. And once he died, then she finally felt this type of sigh of relief because she thought if there's always a chance he can get out of prison and come looking for her because she was the sole survivor. And that sounds quite different than somebody who just forgot about it.
It does, and I know what Oprah you were referring to because I put a large amount of the transcript of that television show in my book. And it's one thing to say she feared him. It's another thing to go on television presenting an official narrative. And that was in Chicago. I don't think that anybody was about to start questioning the narrative at that point in time. That show was invested in the trauma of what happened, the fact that young women are not safe, the women going out on their own were under threat of some, insane person breaking into their house and killing them. I don't think that show had any intention of disturbing the official narrative. And it was, in fact, during that very show that Corazon completely contradicted something that she had said in the aftermath of the crimes. And I caught that and I put it in the book. I said, well, that's real different from what she told police in the very beginning. Part of the narrative was when he first rounded them all up at gunpoint and forced them into the south bedroom. She, Merlita, and Valentina rushed into a closet and shut the door. And in the closet, they tried to decide, we have to do something. We have to rush him. We have to get out of the room. We have to do something. And that was one of the facets of the narrative. During this time, the intruder did not yell at them. He could have fired the gun into the closet. He could have ripped the door open, said, girls, get out of there. No, nothing happened. One of the other nurses came to the door and said, come out of there. He's not going to hurt us. That was a very popular part of the narrative. So rather than proceed with a plan, they relented and they left the closet and they never mounted an attack on Richard Speck. Okay, so that supposedly happened, and then she was asked about that a couple of years later, and she said, "Yeah, we didn't have enough time. We were in the closet, but we didn't have enough time to figure out what to do." Okay, and then go to Oprah in 1993, and Oprah says, "Didn't you think of trying to figure out a plan to get out of that?" And she said, "No, we never did. He was always pointing a gun at us. We didn't do anything." Well, I'm sorry, but the narrative went that they hid in the closet and tried to figure out what to do. Years later on Oprah, no, I was too afraid. He had a gun pointed at me. So which was it? Did they run into the closet? Did they not run into the closet? Did they run into the closet and not have enough time? She also said they were in the closet for 5 minutes. That's a really long time when somebody's trying to rob you and you're behind a closed door. They're not making you come out. They're not brandishing the weapon. They're not firing it. She's in there for 5 minutes, but then says, we didn't have enough time to figure out what to do. 5 minutes, it takes 10 seconds to say, I'll knock the gun, you run for the stairway. So those stories to me that have come down over 50 years just really don't hold any weight, because at the end of the day, she negated all of them by saying, I never did anything. He was pointing a gun at me. I was too afraid.
So, in your theory, when you said that there were multiple perpetrators, at least two, it sounded like you said that the two perpetrators are participating in the murders of the women. Was that correct?
Yes, I
Oh,
said be two, maybe three, two or three,
right, because
definitely more than one. Yeah.
it sounded like what you just laid out then was that there is someone who is staying with the women who has the gun pointed at them continuously. I'm just like, I'm trying to highlight the points of Corazone's story that you've shared that you seem to have some doubts with. And to
Right.
be clear, I have always had my doubts about the story of the South Chicago Massacre, and so did Oprah, as you brought up that quotation, because I think that that's a very, very legitimate question that would have been posed at the time. And I think that was that what you were thinking, that there could be a third person holding the gun or pointing the gun at the women the entire time?
There could have been, but in light of what I'm describing about the three running into the closet, and Richard Speck was the one who was holding the gun in that narrative, so I never carried it over and thought, oh, there was, although it could have been in the real scenario that I think happened, certainly a guy could have had a gun with one or two other guys there. But in the light of what I'm talking about in the closet, Corazon, that was only Richard Speck who had the gun pointed when they ran into the closet. I don't believe at any point in time anybody ran into a closet. Just the logistics of the room and the position of the closet and the fact that he had a gun at them. If they were willing to make that dash into the closet at the risk of being shot in the back or even shot through the closet door, why would they then not go further and try to do something else? They obviously weren't afraid enough of the gun to run with their backs to him. They had to run through the length of a room. The closet was at the opposite end, and they had to go around a bed to get into it. So it wasn't just like a dash. They had to run and turn and then go in the closet, which is a very small closet also for three women to stuff themselves into. So I believe certainly there could have been a man with a gun in the real scenario. But in the scenario of the three running in the closet with Richard Speck holding a gun on them, and he does absolutely nothing to stop that and leaves them in there for 5 minutes. And then the only reason they exit is because another nurse said, come out, he's not going to hurt us. It just kind of, I don't know, doesn't hold water for
No,
me.
that doesn't make sense. I mean,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
really, that really doesn't to me either. And there's just countless examples of things in the South Chicago Massacre that I thought were so bizarre, particularly when we talked at the beginning just about the lack of resistance that is going on with these women. And part of me just is trying to understand and empathize. All right, they're paralyzed with fear.
Mm-hmm.
But I even said this at the beginning. It was one of my own original observations about how once they realized that he had lied, allegedly lied that he didn't only want their money. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want money. I'm just trying to get into New
Right,
Orleans. That
right,
was all made up.
right.
Concocting some type of escape plan. And I know that they're even when they're tied up or something. Okay, let's bite through my bed sheet restraints or something like
Mm-hmm.
that while he's with
Mm-hmm.
somebody else, and something, but not a lot of resistance at all.
Not a lot of resistance for a period of hours, which made the tale of the crime so horrific. I remember that was what got to me as a teenager, was thinking, well, the newspaper report I read didn't help because it said they were all stabbed, shot, raped, and tortured, and blah, blah. And it just was disgusting. And that upset me so badly. And that's part of why it stayed in my mind all these years. It wasn't true, but it was what did actually happen was bad enough without the embellishments. And there were many, many sexual embellishments that I thought were just so disrespectful to these nurses and so horrific to their families. They're actually, I have to come out and say, one of the big foils of this was that the coroner himself refused to confirm that any sexual assaults had taken place. A big chunk of Corazon's testimony was the sexual assault of Gloria Davy. Again, which is it? Was it rape? Was it not rape? When the coroner denies what the star witness is saying on the witness stand and nobody pays attention, there's a problem. And I have the autopsy reports. I have the reports that say that there was no evidence of this type of assault. So to me, I'm going to trust a black and white report to something that a witness who was already shown to be unreliable is going to state.
Really, I was saving this question for the end, but are you
Okay.
saying that there was no evidence of the sexual assault?
There was no evidence of the sexual assault as it was described. Now, I don't want to get real graphic. I'm just trying to find a way around it. But Gloria Davy was the only person who was subjected, according to the official narrative, to this assault. Now, the forensic report reads, the external genitalia are unremarkable. Corazon said she was assaulted for 20 minutes upstairs and then another 30 minutes downstairs on the couch, which was a sodomy. Police said that there was, excuse the graphic nature, but I have to say it, there was mutilation of the anus. The forensic report says the external orifices are unremarkable. Now, is it mutilated or is it unremarkable? That's a world of difference. So what was found was some evidence of semen on her back. Now, and they immediately said, well, that's from Richard Speck because he did blah, 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 blah. But I don't know whose it was. We didn't have DNA then, and I don't know who put it there. It seems to me highly unlikely that she really was attacked in the way it was described. But this, again, it was in plain sight. These errors and inconsistencies and contradictions were in plain sight. And I have trouble believing I'm the only one that saw this in 56 years. I not to take undue credit, but it's like, how come nobody ever looked? Because the official narrative is what circulates. It's in all the books. It's in, whatever source online you will find. If you go to Wikipedia, it's going to say that. It shows that there was not in-depth review because of the way in which he was convicted. He was convicted after 47 minutes of deliberation. They didn't even spend an hour deliberating. He was convicted. He was sentenced to death. The death penalty was taken away. He spent the rest of his life in prison. It was a slam dunk, and that's why people don't pursue the level of rabbit hole digging that I did with this. So people just don't know that the autopsy reports say that. They don't know that certain of the women could not have died when it was said they died because of the state of food in their stomachs. So that is really, Ned, that's why I did this book. When I started to dig in, I just was trying to satisfy my own personal curiosity. But I started to come across so many things, and I was like, this is not right. This does not sound right. And I put myself out there. I'm not an investigator. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a detective. I have never done any investigating to this level. But once I got hooked, it pulled me all the way down. And I just spent 3 years going through everything. And I wasn't satisfied until I had turned over every piece of paper that came across my desk. And these were my findings. And I thought I would be remiss to not put this in a book because this was a serious state of affairs, to have this wool pulled over our faces. And yet when you look at the time that it happened, this was 66. We had Lee Harvey Oswald in 63. We had Sirhan in 68. We had James Earl Ray in 68. These people were very suspect to not being guilty of the crimes they were convicted of. And I believe, I called it in my book, The Decade of the Fall Guy. And it seems to fit. Once you start to discover a pattern that works and you scratch the surface, it seems to fit other patterns. You get a guy who's mentally a little bit off and he has a criminal record and he's a no-gooder, nobody's going to miss him, and he's done a few crimes, and you put him in a certain position to where he could be considered as committing this one particular crime, and there you have it, neat and wrapped up in a package.
Okay, and to be very clear for the listeners, even if you go through some of the older sources that BD Salerno has been talking about how there were 8 women who were raped in the South Chicago massacre, that's most likely completely untrue. Even in the film of that title, Chicago Massacre, about Richard Speck, they also say that all 8 women were raped, and that appears to be nothing but pure fiction. Even in the quote-unquote official narrative that BD Salerno has been disputing, that is a fictionalization. The common understanding of Richard Speck and the Townhouse Massacre is that only the final victim was sexually assaulted, but B.D. Salerno, of course, is disputing, well, more or less everything. I just didn't want people to be too surprised if they found some contrary information.
Right.
And
Right.
overall,
There's a
go ahead.
lot that no, I'm sorry. There's a little lag, so I didn't catch what you were saying. No, I fully believe that people may have trouble taking in what I'm saying. I expect that. I welcome skepticism because I'm a skeptic myself. But I think that in light of everything, I may not be right about everything, but I think there was plenty, and we haven't even scratched the surface in this discussion yet, of the complete panorama of deceptiveness that pervaded this crime, and things that were contradicted and things that were left out and things that were brought in. So, I really appreciate the way you've questioned me, Ned, because these are very vital questions. And I certainly welcome any challenge because it is hard to swallow what I'm saying about this crime. But I think it's the only thing at the end of the day, after all the work I did, it's the only thing that makes sense to me.
Okay, so we're approaching the end of the episode, and you said you're down for some challenges?
Okay. Yes.
Number one, you asked the question, what type of burglar would knock before entering a room or a building, right?
Right.
This is something that is done by criminals where not everyone is going to take people by force. Some criminals, especially people with narcissistic or sociopathic tendencies, will put on a ruse to get the victims under their control, putting people in a false sense of security, which does appear to be consistent with Richard Speck saying that he's made up this story. That's what the ruse is. All I want's your money. I'm only trying to get to New Orleans, and he's trying to act like he's not going to hurt them. Then he, I mean, once the women are tied up and they're just incapacitated, mostly defenseless, and maybe they didn't have a solid plan. Maybe Corazon Amaro did hide under that bed, and I don't know, maybe she's shifting her position a lot and she didn't get bruises and such. So, on the scale of likelihood, like how likely do you think it is that Richard Speck did not commit the South Chicago Massacre? Are you saying 100%, or do you think it's still possible?
I'm going to do high 90s.
Oh, like 90, 96,
98,
97,
98,
98?
yeah, 98, 99. But I do, you raised such an excellent question there, and I'm really glad you did. The knocking on the door. Okay, when he went up the stairs, the the top of that stairway led directly into the south bedroom, which is the bedroom where he herded them all because it was the biggest one. There were 3 women in there at that time. The door's open. He bypasses that, and there's another bedroom. Nina Joe Schmally is in that bedroom in her bed. And Corazon's door is the only one that is closed. And it's not only closed, but locked. If he really was going to commit a robbery, he's right at the top of the stairs facing a room which is packed full of women's belongings, pocketbooks, wallets, purses, jewelry in plain view, because they didn't have storage. The stuff was all over the beds. The place was a mess because it was so crowded, and they didn't have adequate closet space or dressers. They threw everything on their beds, and then when they went to bed at night, they had to put the stuff on the floor. He bypassed that room. Now, somebody who's a smash and grab burglar who just bumbles his way on the scene and takes something and runs with it. That was his golden goose right there. That was the fullest bedroom. Why he would walk past that, where there's 3 women there in bed, and walked all the way to the other end of the hallway where the door is locked and knock on it. That to me was just a little bit too out there.
Wait a second. But I want to be completely clear about something. In my own genuine belief, I, well, firstly, I mean, I was always under the impression that Richard Speck was guilty of this, and I mean, BD Salerno has brought some very, groundbreaking stuff to the forefront. But in the narrative that I understood, Richard Speck went to that house to commit murder, not necessarily to burglarize. All right, if he can grab money, maybe it would have crossed his mind at some point. He's there for hours and he is a criminal. And the ruse is about getting the women in the false sense of security so he can get them into that bedroom and set up what you called organizing the women in the south bedroom. And it's all done for power. So he has power over the situation, gaining control of the situation. I do not believe that he went there specifically to burglarize the house. And I mean, is that like a widely held belief that that was his original intention to burglarize the house, and all of a sudden he just has this moment when he's like, you know what, I'm going to murder 8 women? Is that what most people think?
That was where the narrative took a fork in the road that was, to me, also very suspicious. There's the narrative that he went there to rob them. While he was there, Gloria Davy came in. She had been out on a late night date. She came in, and Gloria Davy had a very close resemblance to his ex-wife Shirley, whom he hated because they didn't get along. There was a lot of domestic violence in the marriage. They had gotten married basically because she had gotten pregnant right away after she met him. And so when he sees Gloria Davy, he snaps, and he then has to kill them because she has riled him up to remember his hatred for his ex-wife. That to me is saying that it was not premeditated. However, they prosecuted the entire case on the premise that it was premeditated murder. So again, I almost did a chapter on this. I didn't do it because I figured I'd beaten it to death enough in the book. I was going to do a chapter saying, so which is it? Was it premeditated? Was it not premeditated? It was first off, I just need money to go to New Orleans. Now you're saying that's how he cajoled them into submission, which is a good point to make, actually. But it was also passed off as he snapped once he saw Gloria Davy and she looked like his wife. So therefore, if they put that theory out there, then they are saying that it wasn't premeditated. So the official narrative, in my view, tripped itself up. It tried to cover too much ground. First of all, he goes there to rob, then he goes there to kill. Which was it? If she made him snap, he wasn't thinking of killing them until he saw her. So I don't know, Ned. It's a puzzle wrapped in an enigma, but I don't see it as premeditated murder. He was going from being a penny ante pocketbook thief to overtaking and murdering 8 women. I mean, it doesn't fit.
Now, wait a second, though. We did say that he is a suspect in the murder of Mary Catherine Pierce. So then, criminal escalating to murder, escalating to mass murder. And I think that with this particular exception, that wouldn't be completely unreasonable to put in terms of psychological profiling, because somebody that's going to commit the mass murder by knife, which isn't exactly what we see. I mean, definitely, when people talk about mass murder these days, they're talking mostly about mass murder by gun. However, to provide some reasons why I said I thought he was going there to commit the crime in a premeditated way, mostly it comes from some material that you shared in about the middle section of this episode, and that was that he was stalking these women. That story. And then I was just like, okay, some guy stalking women, zoning in on the student nurses, and zoning in on women that he may have found conventionally attractive. You could burglarize anybody's house. You could burglarize anybody's house. It looks like has a little bit of money in some type of safe box or something like that. To choose a house that was filled with women whom he deemed to be attractive, that's where I started to think that it was a premeditated murder. And you have just shared an enormous bombshell of information with me that I'm going to be spending the next rest of my life evaluating. So let's be clear. Let's be clear. I'm not just dismissing everything you're saying. But you said you want to challenge questions, so that's more of a challenge statement rather than a question. Are
Did
you
you
with
want
me?
to, yeah. What were you asking me? A challenge statement?
No, no, I
Oh,
just
oh,
said that's a
about the stalking, the stalking. Okay, they said that he was stalking. That was said because when he was trying to get a job with the Merchant Marine, the National Maritime Union was one block up from the nurse's townhouse, and he was really trying to find a job. He went there every day in hopes of getting a job. It was work that he enjoyed, and I think maybe he was trying to maybe turn a leaf. I don't know, but he went there every day. And so he was within a block of the nurses' quarters. We don't know that he stalked them. He was in the proximity of the nurses' quarters on the day of the murders. He was seen there by witnesses. What was turned into stalking was when the law enforcement said he slept in a park behind the townhouse the night before the murders to stalk them. There were many, many myths and stories spread around about things he did that were never corroborated. However, they forgot one thing. The night before the murders, there was a teeming thunderstorm. A lot of rain fell. Richard Speck was not, he was a very finicky man. He was very neat and fussy in appearance. He was not going to lay on a park bench in a thunderstorm to stalk women. So that right there was a hole in that narrative. They promoted that he was a stalker. I said it because that I was going around along with the official narrative I was describing. I don't know that he stalked them. I know that he was a block away from them when he was trying to get work with the Merchant Marine at the NMU, but the stalking was part of the narrative. I don't know that. He could have done it. He could not have done it. I don't know.
Okay, and we are winding down now in this portion of the interview. So, BD Salerno, I would like to know, do you have any final send-off or concluding notes for the audience of Black Box Online Radio?
Well, I want to thank everybody for staying with us and listening to my story, and hope that I have presented, as accurately as I did in the book. And I want to thank Ned for your interest and openness in having me on. And as I said, certainly welcome all challenges because, I never expected to stroll in and dispute a 56-year-old narrative with absolutely no experience in my past in terms of investigations. It's just something that became a love of mine that I felt I wanted to share with people. And my fondest hope for my book is that someone with more expertise, with better knowledge of investigative software or methods, will pick up the ball where I've left it off and travel with it, because I think there is much, much more to be discovered about this case that may extend relevancy even further out into different cases, into different areas. So I certainly welcome all the viewers to do their own research, come up with their own conclusions, but maybe take what I did and carry it a little bit further along.
BD Salerno, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ed. It's been a pleasure.